So I'm Austin. I'm going to be presenting on a PERC report called the 8th grade predictors of 9th grade credit accumulation. And I should mention that unlike the first two presentations, this report has actually not been published yet. It's not finalized yet. So that's important to note for two reasons. I'm interested in talking with people and getting kind of their thoughts on this so that we can sort of take that into consideration as we finalize this report. Second reason it's important to note is to hopefully slightly lower your expectations for this presentation. All right, so why is this study important? So Ted presented and showed that the 9th grade students who were off track at the end of 9th grade were less likely to graduate from high school. Molly presented and showed that approximately 1 in 3 students in the school district of Philadelphia are off track by the end of 9th grade. So if we want to reduce the number of students who are off track at the end of 9th grade, reduce the number of students who fail to graduate from high school, schools need information to be able to identify at-risk students as early as possible. So the idea here is that if we can identify some 8th grade factors that predict that a student will fall off track in 9th grade, schools can begin providing additional support to those students from the very first day of 9th grade rather than having to wait until the end of the first marking period when it might be too late. So we examined 2 cohorts, the classes of 2019 and 2020, and we looked at data on their 8th grade and 9th grade years. The sample first-time freshmen in the school district of Philadelphia in the classes of 2019 and 2020 who are also enrolled in SDP in 8th grade. So my sample slightly differs from Molly's in that students had to have been enrolled in the school district Philadelphia in 8th grade. Same outcome that we're looking at on track at the end of 9th grade means 1 credit in the 4 core courses plus 1 more credit. And so we're going to be looking at which 8th grade factors, academic, behavioral, and demographic, predict that a student will fall off track in 9th grade and not be on track at the end of 9th grade. Okay, so we found that course grades were the strongest predictor of a student falling off track in 9th grade, perhaps not all that shocking. But something that I was a little bit surprised by was that we found that grades in each of the 4 core courses, math, English, science, and social studies, were similarly important. I don't know, some people kind of have a notion that maybe math or science is more important, but we actually found that all 4 8th grade course grades were similarly important. So here are the on-track rates by 8th grade math course grade. And I should say that I just chose math kind of as a for example. I could have just as easily done English, science, social studies here, and the results would have looked very similar. So we see that 93% of students who got an A in 8th grade math were on track at the end of 9th grade, whereas only 21% of students who got an F in 8th grade math were. So we know that students who got an A in 8th grade math are more likely to have, higher attendance, fewer suspensions, better test scores. So we wanted to kind of control for these other factors and essentially say, 2 students who are identical in every way other than course grades. They have the same attendance, same number of suspensions, same test scores. The only difference is that one got an F in math, and one got an A in math. The student who got the A is 48 percentage points more likely to be on track at the end of 9th grade. So you can really see how much course grades really strongly predict being on track at the end of 9th grade. We also looked at the importance of these different thresholds, sort of the AB threshold, BC threshold. We found that the AB and BC thresholds were similarly important. The CD and DF thresholds were somewhat less important, which is to say there are big differences between an A and a B student, big differences between a B and a C student, not as big of differences between a C and a D student and a D and an F student. We also found that attendance, suspensions, and test scores were significant predictors of being on track at the end of 9th grade. So just to run through this table real quick, so 81% of students who had an ADA above 0.95 were on track at the end of 9th grade, whereas only 31% of students who had an ADA below 0.8 were. 75% of students who received no suspensions in 8th grade were on track, whereas only 28% of students who received 3 or more suspensions were. And 94% of students who received an advanced on their math PSSA were on track, whereas only 63% of students who received a below basic were. But again, we want to control for these differences. We know that students who have higher attendance are more likely to have better course grades, fewer suspensions, et cetera. So when we control for these other characteristics, we find that having an ADA above 0.9 is associated with a 16 percentage point increase in the probability of being on track relative to students who had an ADA below 0.8. We found that the first suspension is associated with a 6 percentage point decrease in the probability of being on track, and the second suspension is associated with an additional 4 percentage point decrease. So that's to say the first suspension is the most informative one, but the second suspension is also informative. And earning an advanced on the math PSSA was associated with a 13 percentage point increase in the probability of being on track. All right, so these 4 different factors, course grades, attendance, suspensions, they're all kind of on different scales and different units. So in order to really make fair comparisons between these different factors, we standardize them, put them all in terms of standard deviations from the mean to kind of compare the relative importance. And you can see that course grades really jump out as being the strongest predictors. So 1 standard deviation change in course grades is associated with over a 20 percentage point increase in the probability of being on track, whereas these other 3 factors, ADA, test scores, and suspensions, were associated with less than a 5 percentage point change. You can see kind of among this lower tier that ADA is slightly more predictive than test scores and suspensions. Okay, and we also found that demographics, that race and household income was important as well, was a predictor of being on track at the end of 9th grade. So even after controlling for other factors, we found that Hispanic and Black students were respectively 8 percentage points and 5 percentage points less likely to be on track at the end of 9th grade relative to their white peers. So this is going to be a kind of another not shocking finding, but important to mention. So these risk factors, like having low course grades, having low attendance, not evenly distributed among the schools in the school district of Philadelphia. So it's important to consider this because if we're thinking about how to identify at-risk students, if we want to tell a school, for example, okay, we want you to identify any student who received a suspension in 8th grade. At one school, that might be a handful of students. At another school, that might be half of their incoming freshmen. So the first school is going to be left twiddling their thumbs. The second school probably isn't going to have the capacity to provide additional supports to half of their incoming freshmen. So this is important to consider. So this table puts all of the high schools in the school district of Philadelphia in 3 different buckets by the percentage of incoming freshmen with 8th grade ADA below 0.9. So 17 SDP high schools, less than 10% of their incoming freshmen had low attendance, whereas at 16 SDP high schools, more than 35% of their incoming freshmen had low 8th grade attendance. All right, implications. So SDP could consider implementing an early warning system to help schools sort of think through how to identify the incoming freshmen that are most at risk. So, we've presented and shown that these 4 different predictors, course grades, attendance, test scores, and suspensions are important, and that course grades stand out as being more important, but I think 10 different people could walk away from this and come up with kind of 10 different systems for figuring out which students to prioritize. So this system would sort of find a way to systematize that thinking in a way that's sort of backed up by data and research. And 2 driving principles of this early warning system is that it should accurately identify students who accurately identify at-risk incoming freshmen, and it should be flexible enough to work for all SDP high schools, taking into consideration that fact that risk factors are not evenly distributed among SDP high schools. So we came up with 3 different ideas. I would very much accept any ideas for different names for these. This is just what I came up with for right now because I needed to name them. So going from least complex to the most complex, staggered indicator, stoplight, and predicted probability, and I'm going to quickly go into each of these. So the idea for the staggered indicator approach is that you would identify sort of 5 memorable, simple indicators. And then the order of these indicators would be based on identifying the most at-risk students first, and then the next most at-risk students second. and you would kind of say to high schools, okay, identify students based on this first indicator. If you still have capacity after that number of students you've identified, move on to the second stage. If you still have capacity after that, move on to the third stage. So we tested out a bunch of different combinations. These are the 5 that we came up with. So you would start with failed a core course. Like we said, course grades were the most important predictor. Students who failed a core course in 8th grade are going to be the most at-risk students. If you still have capacity after that, you would move on to students who have an average daily attendance below 0.85, and so on. And we put course grades in there a second time for number 4, just because of how important course grades were. And yeah, like I said, this is the simplest of the 3 approaches. This wouldn't require any sort of like coding into the dashboard. Schools could write these 5 things down on a piece of paper, take it with them, and start using it this September. All right, so the stoplight approach. So you could take those 4 indicators and create 3 different tiers for each of them. Red, yellow, green is kind of the way that I'm thinking about it. This would create 81 different profiles when you combine these 3 tiers across 4 different indicators. And then you could assign an overall risk status to these combinations, to these profiles, based on how students, how previous students with these profiles did in 9th grade. So this is kind of the moderately complex one, requires some data work, would need to be coded into the dashboard. Just to give you kind of a picture of what I'm talking about here. So there's kind of a legend, if you will, on the right that shows what the red, yellow, green tiers are. So for example, course grades, red means that the student got 2 or more D's or F's. Yellow means that the student got no A's or B's in any of their 4 core courses. Green means that they got at least 1 B in one of their 4 core courses. And you can see the rest of them there. But so these are 27 of the potential 81 combinations. These are the 27 that are all green for test scores. So you can see at the top there, the first one, number 28. So this is a student who got 2 or more D's or F's, had low attendance, received 2 or more suspensions, but did okay in terms of test scores. So among previous students with this profile, only 12% of them were on track at the end of 9th grade. Going down to number 30, this is a student who got at least 1 B in one of their 4 core courses, but had low attendance, received 2 suspensions, and had good test scores. Students with that profile, 53% of them in previous cohorts were on track at the end of 9th grade, so we would say that that's maybe a student who's moderately at risk. And then at the very bottom, green, 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 that is a student who got at least 1 B, had high attendance, no suspensions, and good test scores. 86% of students with that profile in previous cohorts were on track at the end of 9th grade. All right, and the final one, sort of the most complex, the predicted probability approach. So this would essentially, all those numbers that I was throwing out earlier, getting an A in math was associated with a 48 percentage point increase, first suspension is associated with a 6 percentage point decrease. You would kind of take all of those numbers together, combine them together, and you could come up with a predicted probability for each individual student. And then the school could potentially say, okay, we have capacity to target 40% or 40 of our incoming freshmen. You could sort by the predicted probability and pick off the 40 students with the lowest predicted probability of being on track at the end of 9th grade. Again, this is the most complex of the 3 approaches, requires some complex data work, and would need to be coded into the dashboard. All right, so in summary, we found that 8th grade course grades were the strongest predictor of an incoming freshman falling off track in 9th grade. Attendance, test scores, and suspensions were also important, but notably less so than course grades. We found that race and household income also mattered, even after controlling for academic and behavioral factors. And we presented multiple options for SDP potentially to implement an early warning system to identify the incoming freshmen most at risk and hopefully keep them on track in 9th grade and subsequently graduate from high school. All right, thank you.